Tēnā koutou, katoa, ka nui te mihi ki a koutou, kua tāmai nei I tēnei ahi. Welcome everybody, nice to be with you and an audience at the same time, and in Wellington. We've just come down from Auckland, so overdressed, thinking that Wellington would be freezing, and it's actually quite lovely today.
Just to kind of warm us into it, I'd love to know about the genesis of this memoir and your motivations for writing it.
There are probably many, it depends on which story I want to tell, but I think probably mainly because I've been working in Māori settings for so long, I've found amongst my Pakeha friends and colleagues, so often they would sort of confess to me, I really find working with Māori difficult. I'm anxious in Māori contexts. I do my best, but it doesn't really seem to work out, and I get tongue-tied and I get anxious, and how do you do it? Like, you know, is there a list of things that I can do in order for the relationship to work? And that's in the context of personal relationships or community relationships or research relationships or institutional relationships, all those kinds of things. And I thought, maybe I can write a book that brings together my own experiences in this relationship over my whole life. And really be very open about the complexities of it, and the ambivalences and the difficulties and all those sorts of things that many of us find really hard to talk about. We think about, but we don't really know how to articulate them. And so that's what I ended up doing. And it's full of stories that make people's toes curl, thinking about being in that kind of situation yourself. And I think a lot of people who are reading it really recognise themselves, a lot of Pakeha really recognise themselves in the stories and the anecdotes that I tell about, you know, the joys and the tears and the ambivalence and the complexity and the sort of ongoing fluidity of that relationship. So I deliberately wrote it as a memoir, in other words, with a personal voice, because I think it's very relatable when you can hear about somebody's life and it's written in the first person. And so I made it personal. I was very revealing about myself, and people say it's quite a brave book because I do talk about the difficulties. I didn't really feel very brave when I was writing it, but I just find the whole thing so interesting. I find all of these things fascinating, and I'm not the kind of person to go, you know, running and hiding under the duvet. Well, sometimes I do actually, but you know, sort of saying it's all too hard. I actually find it really stimulating, all these questions and how they work themselves out on a daily basis. So I guess that's a rather long-winded story of the beginnings of it. Yeah. And then when I thought back about my life, I was born in Auckland and lived in small towns throughout New Zealand. I thought, yes, there's heaps of stories I can tell from when I was really quite small in small town New Zealand, and I just dredged them all up, and they sort of worked as a story. So,
they do work as a story, yes, yeah. A wonderful story. And there's lots in there that I have questions about as well. But you talked at the start just then about anxiety, that people have anxieties. There's a lot that's been written about kind of Pakeha or white discomfort and kind of the importance in some ways of sticking with that discomfort, but at the same time that we often have quite reactionary kind of responses to that discomfort. Is the intention to kind of ease the anxieties and the discomforts, or kind of more point to a way through, or a way that we might be confident in discomfort? Is that an oxymoron? I'm not sure.
Yes, I think both. I think that I go on about being comfortable with discomfort, which sounds kind of twee, because now I'm hearing people saying, yes, I'm going to be comfortable with discomfort, as though that's the kind of new thing to be. I think, oh no, another solution. Whereas my book is really all about how there is no solution. There is no one path, and one day we're going to wake up and say, yay, everything's great. It's just an ongoing, constant, changing, engaged relationship. And so I guess, but in terms of feeling less anxious, yes, I think the book does make people feel less anxious because we're so anxious about our anxiety. And if we can feel less anxious about our anxiety, then good. I don't think we should stop feeling, worried or thoughtful or disturbed by it. But let's just embrace that a bit more and not see it as a kind of fault, and not something we should run away from.
Yeah, cool. Like you said as well in your kōrero about the genesis of the memoir, about the relatability of the book. And so my mum read it just before me, and it really, really resonated with her, particularly the first half where it's about your childhood. And when I read it, that first half felt familiar in some ways, but it also read like another country in lots of other ways. And it was really interesting to me that for my mum, that was the part that she really connected with, and for me it was less comfortable. And then the second half of the book, particularly when you talk about some of the politics and the activist groups in the late 70s and late 80s, I was struck by how familiar lots of those politics were, and some of your own discomforts about how to support the Māori sovereignty movements at the time. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the kind of generational shift, or not, about how Pakeha-ness is engaged with, thought about and theorised, what has and hasn't changed in the past few decades.
Lord, that's a big question. What has and hasn't changed? Well, I guess it's interesting that you say that you thought it was another country, that first sort of the decades. I was born in 1953, so the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and maybe even into the 90s for you, I'm not sure, felt, talking about small town New Zealand, but talking not so much about small town New Zealand so much as Māori Pakeha relations within those small towns. I think I haven't lived in a small town New Zealand for a long, long time, and I don't know whether much has changed there. I suspect when I talk to Māori friends who come from small town places that things haven't changed very much, that there's still quite a divide between those communities. There's still quite a lot of mystery, amongst Pakeha about those Māori and what they're doing and what they want and who they are and so on. I suspect, but I can't say that out of experience. People here might have more experience of that. Certainly in the city, I live in the sort of rarefied atmosphere of the university and, the kind of liberal suburbs of Auckland. So I see around me amongst the students a huge shift, and a real interest in the treaty, te tiriti, Māori culture, language, I really see it. And in fact, over the last 10 years, because I lecture particularly on the period before the treaty, which is my kind of research interest, even that can seem to many people, the way I talk about it, to be quite controversial. And I guess 10 years ago I would get a significant but minority group of a big lecture theatre who you could see rumbling and grumbling and looking at me sideways, and even coming up with some quite sharp negative questions about Māori. And over the last 10 years I've noticed a significant difference to that. Now people are actually, that's really interested rather than defensive. And so I see that that's an interesting shift. And then you've got the next generation down, my grandchildren, who are another thing again and can say Māori words without even trying correctly, without even thinking about it, because of what they're getting at the kindergarten or the kohanga or the school. So, things shift and change, but I don't think we're necessarily on the road to salvation,
Yeah.
I just think we're in a particular moment in our history that's playing out in a certain way, and it will continue to play out in different kinds of ways into the future.
Yeah, I thought that kind of sense of mystery and desire was something in there that, and I think what you're so I'm a geographer, so I'm all about place and space. So what you're saying in part is that it's not about time, it's about place and space, maybe about where these kind of things happen. In the sense of kind of mysterious others that you desire connection with and desire to have some of the things that Māori communities have, like that sense of culture in lots of ways.
Yes, I think one of the things that comes through in my early life is, as a child, being in a family. I had 4 brothers and sisters, who all came together, English immigrant parents who were quite stressed, I think, being in a new country, and there wasn't a lot of physical affection or laughter in that kind of gutsy way that I saw around me amongst Māori. And so I did. I had a deep desire as a child to be part of that. That was warm, that was laughing, didn't care about the rules, the middle class rules that we always had to live by with a certain sort of clothing and language and so on. So I always had that desire as a child. And so that made me very attracted to Māori kids at school. And I tell a funny story in the book. Some of you, if you've read it, will remember all my adult life I've kind of sheeted home my interest in Māori to this particular girl at school, a primary school in Dannevirke, of all places. Her name was Maria. And I always used to talk very affectionately about Maria. I've always talked very affectionately about Maria and how I went to her house when I was 8 and had lunch there, and it was terribly exciting, and I had my lunchbox, and we weren't really allowed out of school at lunchtime, but we ran over the road and I had my lunchbox, and they had a boil up on the table, and it was very exciting. I was offered some boil up and I said no thank you, and I had my lunchbox. But I loved being in Maria's house. I loved being in her bedroom, and I described the bedroom, and everything was just sort of like this rosy, originary story of me falling in love with a Māori family and kind of seeing something else. And then when I was writing this book, I decided, I'll go back to all these places that I was brought up in and check them out and see a few of the old mates. And so I got in touch with Maria, thank you, Google or Facebook or something. And of course, when I met Maria at a cafe in Dannevirke, I said, Maria, I remember going to your house and the boil up and your bedroom and the yellow candlewick bedspreads, and I was all romantic about it. And she sort of looked at me, she said, you never came to my house for lunch, and I didn't have yellow candlewick bedspreads, and no, I didn't have a sister, and no, we never had boil ups on the table. My parents always had the boil up on the bench, and we, I said, do you remember me at all? And she sort of said, well, yes, sort of. I think she was being a bit generous. The thing she remembered when we were 8, this is not picking me for her sports team, and she actually apologised all these years later. But that kind of fascinated me, that memory that was actually not, I had actually been to this house and the yellow bedspreads and so on, but it was a Pakeha family. And living on the same street on the other side of the road. We worked this out. But I had it's sort of illustrative of that idea of mystery and desire, these kind of strong desires and a strong sense of mystery and attraction to it, that I had actually created this whole memory that I sort of clung on to as an adult. And Maria was very kind to me, and she laughed like a drain, and we got on really well. But it was really it made me think about desire and memory. Yeah,
and especially interesting hearing you reflect on kind of how central that kind of myth has been, and lots of kind of, I guess, your professional and personal identity. And
I've told that story a few times. It's embarrassing.
I was really struck by your honesty in the book about some of the more uncomfortable stuff, like you alluded to at the start. And I think some of it chimed with some of the thinking I've been doing about accountability. So how Pakeha own our stuff, own our mistakes, be accountable for ourselves, but not in a self-loathing way. And our communities, as we kind of continue to sort of work out who we are, but how we do it without demanding more generosity from Māori. And you say in the book that you're sort of a bit dumbstruck by that huge generosity from Māori, that Māori communities stick with us through a whole lot of stuff, and the kind of gentleness and care that we receive as we kind of bumble our way through a whole lot of situations. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, this is a big worry for me at the moment, because I think as Pakeha, and through books like this, as Pakeha become more confident as Pakeha and take up that identity of Pakeha and understand more about the treaty, te tiriti, etc., there becomes a kind of an insatiable desire and demand from Māori. Teach us your language, teach us your culture. I'm becoming a Pakeha, and to be a Pakeha I have to relate to you as a Māori person and Māori culture and Māori language. So we're all running around saying, yes, Māori language should be compulsory in schools. I'm saying, well, who's going to teach it? You know, there's this assumption that there's this Maori community out there just kind of brimming with energy and time and information that are going to rush and help us all, save us all, you know, which is just obscene, actually. And so as we become more excited and interested in our own particular history and our own particular identity, and therefore want to know more and become different and better in our relationships with Māori, I have seen that kind of increased desire and demand, love me, teach me, you know, to Māori friends and colleagues. And they've just got long lists of people who want their time and energy. And, you know, when you've got a part of the population, as we have in New Zealand, who've been totally and utterly dispossessed of their economic base for the last 100 odd years, to expect that community suddenly that has, you know, been so devastated, to sort of suddenly pick themselves up and be available for Pakeha is madness. And it produces a lot of anxiety in me, and probably it came to a crescendo when a wee while ago I was in a kitchen at a marae, and a Pakeha young man walked into the kitchen speaking fluent Māori to the women in the kitchen, and they didn't speak Māori, and they were Māori women. I mean, it's all good. It's learning Māori is a good thing, but I can see it feels sometimes like another form of possible imperialism, and another set of demands that are impossible to be met, and therefore lead to all sorts of difficulties. And I think that becoming Pakeha is not just a cultural identity thing, it's actually a political thing, and it has to have the politics absolutely woven in with the kind of, you know, oh, I can speak Māori, I can, you know, go onto a marae and feel happy, I can do my waiata, I can chat and, you know, whatever. But it's got to have a politics, it's got to be enmeshed with a strong sense of social justice and social movements towards social justice, for sure. Otherwise, it's just a disaster, really. We just become flasher in ourselves, but nothing changes.
I think that's fascinating, and it's something that requires constant navigation, especially, you know, when you're wanting to advocate for the social justice things, that you like that constant reflection of not being the most right on Pakeha in the room as well, and like how you do that, how you carefully navigate the social justice stuff without kind of claiming a space that isn't yours as well.
Well, my friend Te Kawiho Hoskins, you know, she said you Pakeha can open the door, but doesn't mean to say there's a whole lot of Māori out there waiting to rush through it. You know, and I thought, oh yeah, that's a good point. It's a good point.
A very similar metaphor was used recently in some discussions about ideas around decolonising our universities and things like that. About smashing down the doors and the walls and things like that. But of course, why would Māori necessarily want to engage with institutions that are quite often very colonial in their makeup still?
But you can also say many Māori want what the Western University is providing as well. So we can't just make an assumption about what Māori want. So rushing in to say, tear down the institution so Māori come flooding in. Well, you know, that's very patronising in itself. And many of my students want the tohu, they want the PhD, they want what the Western University offers. They want to be bicultural, bilingual, be able to be highly skilled in both of those cultural contexts, which was, of course, being someone who knows quite a bit about what happened before the treaty, that's what the tupuna wanted, that's what Māori wanted in inviting Pakeha to come here, which is what they did in the early 1800s. That's what they wanted. They wanted access to the best of the outside world, so that they could engage in it as Māori, powerfully. And it's still, I think, from my students and colleagues, that's still a desire. So it can be quite fallacious to think, you know, the idea of decolonising the university is kind of making it something other than it is. And I say that as a colleague of yours in the university. We've got huge criticisms of the university, but there are aspects of the Western canon, Western forms of thinking that are powerful and important, and we all need to know them, rather than saying, oh, just rip those aside, I think.
Where does this Pakeha life sit within the kind of broader canon of work about what it means to be Pakeha? So thinking about Michael King's work, but also Avril Bell and Anne Salmon and others. What are the kind of tensions or complementarities of your book and your thinking in relation to those other works?
They all work in their own little way, don't they? Very differently. I mean, Anne Salmon's had an enormous impact, and I'm enormously indebted to her as a Pakeha and her thinking. Michael King, I wrote about him a little bit in the beginning of here because I was going to call this something like Being Pakeha or Becoming Pakeha or something, but he pinched all those titles. And I thought, well, how's this going to be different from what Michael did? And I ended up sort of having a little feminist moment because Michael's books on being Pakeha always seemed to me somewhat cerebral. I don't know what other people feel, but it was sort of very much head stuff, and I enjoyed that. But for me, being Pakeha has got a lot more to do with my guts and my spirit and my heart, if I can use those words. It's a sort of the down and dirty. And so this is what I felt that, just a stereotype, as a woman, I was experiencing the world through, a more kind of emotional way, and also sort of some spiritual elements that I didn't think that Michael had in the heart of his books. So it felt quite different for me, and I ended up thinking it was maybe to do with gender, and also maybe to do with the moments in which we were writing. But no, I see it as quite different from his work. And Avril Bell's work is really good on colonisation and settler society. She's still writing in a far more kind of academic way, but she's really leading thinking in that area too. Yeah. But I think let many flowers bloom. All write books about being Pakeha. It's all good stuff, It's all we all do different things, and we come at it in different sorts of ways.
Where do you think your book sits as we sort of count down over the next 19 years to 2040 and marking 200 years since Te Tiriti was signed? Where do you think it fits within that trajectory, and how do you think in 19 years' time your book will be received?
Well, of course, I want it to be on everybody's lips. Everybody would have a copy on their bookshelf. No, I think that it just sits as a sort of snapshot, I think, of a time, and one particular experience of that time. In the whole kind of huge, long history of Māori-Pākehā relations. And you can write about all those moments in different kinds of ways, and this is just sort of a snapshot from me of the kind of 50s to the 2000s. That's just a kind of a snapshot that sits in there. Where things will go, I honestly don't know. I sometimes wonder whether Pakeha are going to become a kind of weird minority in New Zealand, I honestly have no idea where we'll be in even 20 years. I mean, 20 doesn't seem very far away, doesn't it? Because I think, 20 years back when we were working, or 40 years back when we were working as feminists, we thought the world would change, and I think, okay, we worked hard, but, really capitalism and climate crisis trumps everything.
Thank you so much for your time, for the book as well. I feel like this is a very timely piece of work. It's generous and engaging, another piece in this big conversation that we need to be having. Thank you so much, Alison. It's been amazing.